Hear the word of the Lord from the books of Genesis and Exodus. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. The children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were also born on Joseph's knees. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "I am about to die, but God will surely come to you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." So Joseph made the Israelites swear, saying, "When God comes to you, you shall carry my bones up from here." And Joseph died, being 110 years old. He was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah; Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin; Dan and Naphtali; Gad and Asher. The total number of people born to Jacob was 70. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and that whole generation. But the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Good morning. Happy New Year, everybody. What? No, for many of us, September is really the new year, not January. I don't know about the rest of you, but for me, this is the new year. I mean, week one of the NFL. I mean, this is, the year has begun. The year has begun. Be free, stay free. That has been our guiding theme this year. Just as a recap, we began the year by looking deeply into Paul's letter to the Galatians. We followed that by unwrapping the gift of wonder, using Christine Sine's book as our framework. We moved from there to the book of Psalms as we reflected together on our freedom to worship. And today, we begin a long journey into the book of Exodus. The theme, be free, stay free, is still our guide, but by transitioning to Exodus, the theme, be free, stay free, shifts a little, it transitions. We make an important shift in considering freedom. We'll be considering the liberation of a whole people for the sake of all peoples. So if the first half of the year emphasized personal freedom, what it means to live freely from the law and more into grace, from being too serious and freed up to be more into wonder and play, moving from superficiality and more into authenticity and genuine worship, personal dimensions of freedom, then Exodus causes us to consider the social dimensions of freedom, which is important because God isn't just interested in freeing us individually. As we'll see, God is also interested in liberating communities and nations, the whole world, in fact, from all that enslaves, oppresses, and crushes. Exodus is the story of God liberating the Israelites from Egyptian oppression, as well as the story of God turning a loose cluster of tribes into a nation in fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham and Sarah in Genesis 12. I don't know how many times I have read the book of Exodus through the decades, but it was only in preparation for this series that I realized the significance of how the book begins and ends. It begins, by the way, feel free to turn your chairs so you don't hurt your necks. It begins with the Israelites building buildings for Egypt via forced labor, and ends with them building the tabernacle to God as a free and independent nation. It's a journey from slavery to liberation. That's just the beginning, really, of the book. The bulk of the story is actually the Israelites trying to figure out how to be a nation after their liberation. And not just any old nation, but God's nation, which was to reflect the justice and peace and compassion and love of God, not just for their benefit, but for the benefit of the whole world. Exodus is the story of God's intervention in human affairs. And to me, it's filled with the stuff of Hollywood. An evil empire, a suffering people, gory plagues, blood-red rivers and parting seas, a reluctant hero, the making of a nation, and a God whose heart is set on saving the world through an idol-prone, ungrateful, imperfect, and broken people. This is the book of Exodus. And as we'll see, this is us. Now, I know Cecil B. DeMille made an epic movie about it back in the day. Anyone care to guess, without consulting Professor Google, when this movie was made? Anybody? Earlier. What? Earlier. 1956. 1956. I think it's time to remake it in a blockbuster kind of way. You think? Maybe Denzel Washington can play Moses or something. Anyway, what I hope we'll see throughout the series is that this story is ongoing from generation to generation, and that our generation is directly connected to it despite being 3,000 years removed, give or take, from the Exodus events. I believe the themes and lessons in the Exodus story still speak today, loudly and clearly and relevantly, perhaps especially during an election year that will likely determine what kind of future the United States will live into in the coming years. So Lord, speak to us through this series. Speak to us today and show us a little more about what it means to be your people at such a time as this. Amen. Now, folks, I am positive that most, if not all of us, have been part of a startup. That we've been on the ground floor of an exciting, scary, risky venture that everyone, including you, were confident about, even if no one knew where we were going or how we were going to get there. I'm positive because I know many of you were part of the original 40 who started this thing called Grace Fellowship Community Church. Now, for you that were there, do you remember those days? Okay, just some words that come to mind when you think of that time. Exciting. What? Adventurous. New. What? Naive, okay. Youth, like you were young once, right, Daniel? Okay. It was exciting, wasn't it? I mean, there was probably some risk involved too. Some naivete, you're right, Carolyn? But it was exciting. Now, I'm willing to bet that those who weren't there can resonate with those words and sentiments when you think of a startup that you may have been a part of. For me, I remember starting a community development organization in Zambales province in the Philippines, which was buried literally by the infamous volcanic blast of Mount Pinatubo in 1991. Out of the ashes, 7 lay people, 7 pastors, and I founded Light Ministries, which stood for livelihood, income generation, health, and training. I remember those days. The passion and the energy we had to help rebuild communities. The excitement of seeing people get back on their feet. The vision to see water wells built, preschools opened, small industries rejuvenated and created, health services and medicines accessed. The sense of unity and confidence in God's compassion and justice for the people. These were exciting, risky, difficult, rewarding times through which the 7 lay people turned community development specialists, the 7 pastors, and the growing number of Light beneficiaries bonded together through crisis. And these are their names: Jojo, Becky, Lerma, Ronnie, Anna Marie, Saldi, and Francis. And pastors Asban, Caprice, Alvear, Fabra, Narciso, Advincula, and Capalto. These are the names. And that is the way the book of Exodus begins. And it is significant. It's an historical statement looking back on who had been a part of the promise, and it was also looking ahead, conveying something like, hey, we're still here. And we march on toward the fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham and Sarah. These are the names. There is something really compelling about the Israelites before they became a nation, evoking those same startup emotions I felt when I found myself at the front end of something new and exciting and noble. These are the names, it seems, by considering that just that short statement that begins the book of Exodus, it seems like a good day today to remember what animated us when the passion to be a part of something big for God burned intensely. Yes, like when Grace Fellowship started, but for those who weren't there, when something else that you were a part of was in its beginning stages. I want us to get in touch with that passion when it first began, whatever that was. I'm convinced, folks, that passion, that passion, that ideal that fueled us at the beginning, need to be revisited from time to time. And I want us to do that today as we reflect on the experience of the Israelites right before they became a nation. Before Israel was a nation, the Israelites were just people. This short but powerful sentence, these are the names, speaks to the importance of people. Before Israel was a nation, the people were just that, people, with names and families and jobs and hobbies and quirks and praises and prayer requests. And they were the center. When you think back on those beginning days, I'm willing to bet that people were the center. Relationships were key. Before Israel was added to the table of nations, the Israelites were just a loose grouping of tribes defined and propagated by the 12 sons of Jacob, whose name, if you'll recall, became Israel in Genesis 32:28. At the core of what was to become the nation of Israel was simply people, and they were what mattered. Israel was a kingdom before it was a kingdom. This is really important to remember because in the creating of institutions, whether we're talking about a nation or a church, the first thing that seems to go out the window is people. I'm not sure what happens when we organize ourselves into institutions, including churches, but too often we forget about the very reason the institution was created, namely, people. I'm sure I have said this before in another sermon or two, but it's worth repeating. When an institution demands that it be served by the people and not the other way around, then I am certain the Holy Spirit has left the building. Now, as long as people, relationships, remain central to who we are and what we do as the people of God, we remain faithful to our calling. Now, that's the positive way of saying it. Let me say it in the negative. If the ideal of the church, which is just another form of institution, becomes more important than people, then not only do we suffer, our calling to be the church in a hurting world is thwarted. Folks, run away as far as you can, as fast as you can, from a church or any institution that develops a life of its own and then starts demanding to be served. For it won't be long before said institution becomes toxic. I believe this is why many people, especially the younger folk, are fleeing churches. They may not say it that way, but it's the toxicity of institution. The rigid rules and regulations, the restrictions of policies and procedures, the plastic conformity to the status quo, the priority to preserve and protect. These things drive people away. And in that light, I say, yeah, flee. Now that said, I say flee the institution, but run toward God, who dwells not in private places, so you and God can have your own little thing, but run toward God, who dwells in community. In other words, flee institution, but run toward genuine community. And what do I mean by community? I mean, at least in part, where people still matter. Where our humanness, our stories, our families, our imperfections, our contributions, etc., still matter. Institution, no. God and me is enough? No. Genuine community, lifeline, yes. And I aspire in the Spirit for Grace Fellowship to be a place of genuine community that people can run to as they run away from toxicity. I aspire to be that. And I know you do too. Like in those startup days, when we as people were front and center, remember? Folks, as long as people continue to matter, we're on track to becoming, in the words of the promise, a great nation through which all the families of the earth will be blessed. So these are the names. So, sisters and brothers, are people still our reason for being? Are the personal relationships that we develop and nurture and enjoy as we seek God together still the reason that we do church? To the extent that it is, church is the space wherein we can flourish as a community, growing in our love for God, one another, and neighbor. Let's go a step further. People mattered in Israel's pre-national days, in their startup. But it's not just the mere grouping of people that ignites movements, or in the case of Israel, that creates a nation. It's people of promise. Not just people getting together, but people of promise getting together. People with a sense of destiny. They were driven forward by a promise. That's why I had Irene read the end of Genesis along with the beginning of Exodus. Genesis ends with Joseph expressing his dying wish. Now, Joseph lived a long life, able to see his progeny to the third generation, I think, which makes him a great grandfather, yeah? Or is it great? Anyway. He lived a meaningful life too. He was the governor of Egypt. And he was the reason Egypt and surrounding regions survived the years of severe famine. The last words of this remarkable man was to request that his bones be taken with them when they arrived in the land promised to them through Abraham and Sarah. Genesis 50:26 says that Joseph was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt, meaning he was probably mummified and treated like Egyptian royalty at his death. And that would have been a very desirous place for anyone to have been buried in such a special way and placed in such a prestigious place. But for Joseph, there was something more desirous. He wanted to be a part of the fulfillment of God's promise. More than anything else, Joseph wanted to be a part of that. His request points to the fact that the Israelites, Jacob's 12 sons and their families, were driven by a promise, a hope. They weren't just people bound together by blood or kin. They were a people propelled forward by a promise. These people, B'nai Israel, had a strong sense of destiny, a calling, a mission. 200 years after the promise was made to Abraham and Sarah, that sense of destiny was still their reason for being. And the nature of that promise? That they were going to be a great nation through which all the families of the earth will be blessed. That's Genesis 12:3. Now I'm going to fast forward for just a second here, because I must tell you that the church today, yes, with a capital C, but also with little c's like Grace Fellowship, is but the people that keep this hope alive. No longer, however, as a single nation, but as the people of God of all nations. But the promise, folks, is still to become that great nation through which all the families of the earth will be blessed. That's still the same promise. And it's what should propel us to be who we are and why we do this every week. Now, folks, you know what that's called? It's called mission. It's called mission. This is why I'm so fanatical about mission. In case you didn't know. Mission and church are the two sides of the same coin. To reflect God's love, mercy, peace, justice, and joy in the world, even as we ourselves are in desperate need of these things, is our reason for being. And to the extent that we engage the world in mission, we move forward. We move toward our own healing, our own wholeness, our own flourishing. Which leads to the last insight I'll share today from the passage. It says in verse 7 that the Israelites were fruitful and prolific, that they multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now, what I get from this is that as the Israelites remained people-centered and promise-driven, they flourished. It was in living into their purpose as the people of God that they experienced great prosperity in the land of Egypt. The key to our flourishing, Grace Fellowship, is to live into the truths of the first two insights, the importance of people and our faithfulness to the promise of God to redeem the world and everyone in it. Because the Israelites were faithful to who they were as people of the promise, they flourished. Not just numerically, but in every sector of Egyptian society. That's what it means to have been fruitful and to have grown exceedingly strong in verse 7. These words go beyond numerical growth. They convey that the Israelites became prominent in the most powerful nation on earth at that time. Now, as we'll see next week, the Egyptian empire didn't like all of this flourishing. And an insecure king took the throne who knew not Joseph and did something about it. And we'll get to that. We'll get to that next week. Today, what we learn is that the Israelites were in a good place. They were flourishing. And I believe it was because they remained faithful as people of the promise. At that point in their history, before they became a nation, they regarded each other and cared for each other as real people do. And together they were bound by the promise of greatness for the sake of the world. So how about it, Grace Fellowship Community Church? I know we're just 41 years old, but that's long enough to institutionalize, isn't it? It's long enough to forget about people, that we're about people, and to forget about the promise. God calls us today to remember the good old days, not just for the sake of the good old days, but to propel us forward to better days. Remember the good old days, but for the purpose of renewing our commitment to God's people in San Francisco and around the world. Our flourishing depends on it. Let's pray.